The rope bites into your palm as the camel jerks against its lead, its guttural groan rolling into the night like a warning. Heat still clings to the sand beneath your boots, though the desert sky is already black and star-streaked. Each step grinds grit into your teeth, scrapes it raw across your tongue. The air smells of sweat-soaked wool, dried dung smoke, and the faint iron tang of coin. Ahead, torches sputter in the wind, halos of firelight stretching thin across the dunes. The caravan moves like a single creature, restless, tired, and hungry, yet bound together by the weight of its cargo. Your fingers brush the bundles strapped to the beast's side, silk bolts wrapped tight and gleaming faintly under the torchlight, worth more than your life. Worth enough that guards walk with iron at their belts while you carry nothing but rope. Their spears glint whenever the flames shift, their gazes fixed outward into the dark. You glance at one, but he does not see you. Or perhaps he chooses not to. Hierarchy is as sharp here as the desert wind, invisible yet cutting, dividing those who command from those who endure. You tug the rope tighter, pretending control while the skin on your hand burns. The bells tied to the lead animal jangle unevenly, a sound meant to steady the line but one that grates in the silence. Somewhere behind you a child coughs, the sound quickly smothered by a mother's hand. No one wants weakness to echo across the dunes, not when eyes might be watching. The Taklamakan does not forgive noise. A gust tears through the ridge and slaps sand against your face. You squint, forcing yourself forward, each step heavier than the last. The caravan master raises a torch high, the light spilling briefly across jagged rocks and shifting dunes. For a moment, the landscape looks alive, moving, but no one dares to speak. Then the smell hits. Smoke, thick and woody, not from your camp's dung fires, but from something larger, closer, deliberate. The guards stiffen, one muttering under his breath. The caravan slows, the bells falling into a nervous silence. Ahead, the horizon flickers with more light than there should be. Torches, where there should only be stars. You grip the rope so tightly your knuckles ache, heart pounding with the rhythm of the restless camel. Every instinct screams to keep moving, yet every step feels like walking into a blade you cannot yet see. And for the first time tonight, you wonder if fortune and death are waiting in the same place. The Silk Road story began in the reign of the Han emperors, when China's capital at Chang'an thrummed with ambition. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, Emperor Wu sought to strengthen his armies against the fierce nomadic tribes who thundered down from the northern steppes. Horses were the prize he coveted, not the small, hardy mounts of the Chinese frontier, but the great stallions of Fergana, animals so tall and swift they were said to sweat blood. To gain them, he offered what his empire alone could produce in abundance: silk fine as mist, shimmering in colors that shifted under lamplight. Envoys were dispatched into the unknown, carrying bolts of silk across deserts and mountains. The most famous, Zhang Qian, returned after years of captivity with reports of fertile valleys, bustling markets, and lands where vines grew heavy with grapes. His journeys stitched the first fragile threads of connection between East and West. Traders followed in his wake, and the paths he mapped became arteries of exchange, winding through the Hexi corridor, skirting the deadly Taklamakan, and climbing the passes of the Pamirs, where men gasped for breath in the thin air. The Silk Road was never a single road, but a living web. To the south, trails branched toward India, bringing spices that perfumed the air and gemstones that sparkled like fire. To the west, paths wound into Persia, where glassware gleamed in market stalls and rugs carried patterns of stars and gardens. Farther still, caravans carried their treasures into the heart of the Roman Empire. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Roman senators draped themselves in silk, so sheer that critics in the Senate thundered against its indecency. What began as tribute for horses had grown into a trade that reshaped fashion, economy, and morality. The road carried more than goods. Every caravan brought gossip, ideas, and the rhythm of distant lands. Merchants who departed from Chang'an with silks might return with unfamiliar spices, new stories of gods, or foreign musicians plucking strings no Chinese ear had yet heard. As these exchanges deepened, the Silk Road became less an experiment and more a lifeline. Empires rose and fell along its edges, but its pulse remained steady, beating to the sound of camel bells across sand and stone. By the close of the Han dynasty, the Silk Road was already a force greater than any single ruler. It bound together kingdoms that would never meet, and it whispered of worlds that lay just beyond the horizon, waiting to be reached. A caravan on the Silk Road was less a procession and more a moving city. Camels groaned under their loads, their padded feet pressing steady tracks into the sand while bells fastened to their necks clinked in uneven rhythm. Mules carried bundles of spices and tools, while carts creaked with crates of porcelain, bolts of silk, and amphorae of oil. Guards rode on horseback at the edges, spears and bows ready, their eyes sweeping every horizon. The line could stretch for miles, a living artery of commerce threading through the wilderness. Daily life was a test of endurance. At dawn, men and women rose from mats still damp with dew, their joints stiff from sleeping on hard ground. Bread was stale, dried fruit sticky, and water rationed carefully from goatskin flasks. By midday, the sun scorched the desert until sand burned like fire beneath boots. Sweat stung eyes and carved salt into every garment. When the sun finally fell, the cold arrived with equal ferocity, forcing merchants to huddle in cloaks and guards to stamp their feet against frost. The desert was not neutral, it was hostile, and each day survived felt like a negotiation with nature itself. Hierarchy ordered the march. Wealthy merchants clustered near the center, where their goods could be most easily protected. Guards flanked the edges and rode at the front, their authority sharpened by necessity. Caravan masters commanded respect, chosen for their memory of wells, trade routes, and the shifting moods of tribes along the way. At the rear trudged handlers, laborers, and slaves, their work unending and their safety least assured. This was the invisible architecture of survival, a reminder that even on the open road, power followed strict lines. Nights offered relief, but only a fragile one. Camps sprang up near rivers, oases, or fortified caravanserais, where high walls and locked gates promised a few hours of safety. Fires smoked as dung, and brush burned low, filling the air with a bitter tang. Men traded stories over bowls of lentils and mutton, describing lands that others could only imagine. A Persian might boast of glassware so clear it seemed like ice. A Sogdian might sing in a language thick with consonants and rhythm. A Chinese merchant might recite poems of Chang'an, longing for the city's bustling markets and lantern-lit courtyards. The caravan was never only about trade. It was about endurance, discipline, and trust in strangers. Each man and woman knew that a single mistake could scatter the line, leaving the weak to vanish into sand or snow. Yet they pressed on, bound by the same fragile hope. The Silk Road was more than dust beneath their feet. It was a promise that every mile of hardship would lead to a place where survival might turn into fortune. For all its deserts and mountains, the Silk Road was defined as much by its cities as by its wilderness. Caravans that survived weeks of dust and silence often emerged into dazzling marketplaces where the world seemed to gather in a single breath. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, and Merv became the beating hearts of the trade routes, each one thriving as a crossroads where language, faith, and ambition collided. Samarkand, rising from the plains of Sogdiana, shimmered with turquoise domes and crowded bazaars. Here, silk from China brushed against spices from India, while Persian rugs lay beside Byzantine glassware. Bukhara, further west, pulsed with scholarship. By the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, its mosques and madrasas attracted thinkers who charted the stars and debated the laws of faith. Kashgar, perched at the edge of the Taklamakan, served as a gatekeeper. Every caravan passing through its streets left behind a fragment of culture, from Buddhist monks carrying sutras to Muslim merchants reciting prayers at dawn. The caravanserai was the essential sanctuary of these cities. Massive inns built of stone or mud brick, they offered high walls and iron gates where merchants could finally loosen their grip on the ropes of their beasts. Inside, camels knelt in wide courtyards. Goods were unpacked, and fires burned without fear of ambush. For a night, hierarchy softened. Guards, handlers, and merchants sat side by side, sharing bowls of food and trading stories. One man might speak of Baghdad's great libraries, another of Constantinople's crowded harbours, another of Chang'an's lantern festivals. The caravanserai became more than lodging. It became a theatre where the Silk Road performed its role as a bridge of worlds. Religions echoed through these cities with equal force. In Kashgar, Buddhist monasteries carved into cliffs glowed with lamps and echoed with chants that rose into the mountain air. In Samarkand, the call to prayer drifted across tiled courtyards, uniting merchants and scholars in devotion. In Bukhara, Christian merchants whispered prayers in secret, their crosses hidden but their faith intact. The Silk Road did not belong to one creed, but to all of them, each carried forward by footsteps and camel hooves. What defined these cities was not merely the wealth displayed in their bazaars, but the connections forged in their crowded streets. Every deal struck under an awning, every coin exchanged in a shadowed alley, rippled outward across continents. A Persian rug might end in a Chinese court. A Roman glass vessel might rest on a table in Samarkand. A story told by a monk might inspire a listener to travel farther than they ever dreamed. In these exchanges, the Silk Road revealed itself not as a single path, but as a living web where the world paused, collided, and carried echoes into distant lands. The Silk Road earned its name from the shimmering cloth that first drew Rome's attention, yet silk was only one thread in a vast tapestry of exchange. From east to west flowed treasures that dazzled foreign markets. Porcelain so fine it rang like a bell when struck, lacquerware polished until it reflected lamplight like still water, and paper that would eventually reshape the way empires recorded their laws and their stories. Spices drifted from India, saffron bright as flame, cinnamon curled like bark, soaked in sweetness, and pepper sharp enough to sting the tongue. From Central Asia came hardy horses, their strength forged on the steppes, prized by emperors and generals alike. Westward, Persia contributed glassware that shimmered like frozen streams, intricate metalwork, and carpets woven with patterns of gardens and stars. From Arabia and North Africa came ivory, gold, and perfumes, their scents clinging to cloth long after the caravans had passed. Rome sent wool, wine, and silver coins, stamped with the faces of emperors who would never see the lands their currency travelled. The Byzantines offered brocades stitched in gold thread, luxuries that glittered even in the dimmest bazaar. These goods were not merely possessions, they were signals of status and tools of power. In the Roman world, senators wore silk so sheer that critics railed against its decadence, calling it unmanly and corrupting. In China, horses imported from Fergana were called heavenly, their speed and stamina symbols of imperial strength. Spices could preserve meat, heal illness, or mask decay, giving them value far beyond flavor. Every item carried meaning, wealth, and influence, far beyond its material worth. But the Silk Road was not only a trade of objects, it was a trade of ideas. Buddhist monks traveled eastward, carrying scrolls and teachings that would take root in China and flourish in Japan. Muslim scholars carried astronomy, medicine, and mathematics westward, their knowledge shaping the Renaissance centuries later. Christian missionaries moved east, bringing stories of saints and martyrs, their icons tucked in packs beside bolts of cloth. Music, stories, and even recipes followed the same trails, carried in memory and song as much as in goods. The exchanges were never simple. A bolt of silk leaving Chang'an might pass through 10 hands before it reached a Roman merchant. Each time it changed owners, its value multiplied, and each exchange carried with it a new layer of influence. A single coin or jewel could cross empires, leaving behind traces of language, custom, and belief. In this way, the Silk Road became more than a line of trade. It became a stage where cultures performed before one another, adapting, borrowing, and transforming. By the height of its power in the early centuries of the Common Era, the Silk Road was not only moving goods, it was moving civilizations, weaving them together with every bell, every bargain, and every step upon the dust. For every treasure that glittered in the markets of Samarkand or Constantinople, there were dangers waiting in the wilderness to claim it. The Silk Road was not a gentle path. It was a gauntlet, lined with threats as old as the desert itself. Bandits haunted its trails, lurking in canyons and dunes where torchlight could not reach. Raiders knew the rhythm of caravans, how bells jingled against camel hides, how wheels creaked under weight, and how fear rippled through travelers at night. A single ambush could scatter months of planning, leaving silk bolts trampled in the dust and merchants cut down before they could draw breath. Natural barriers proved no kinder. The Taklamakan Desert, whose very name was whispered as, "You go in, but you do not come out," swallowed entire expeditions in storms of sand. Shifting dunes erased trails overnight, leaving travelers circling endlessly in silence until thirst claimed them. To the north loomed the Gobi, its winters so bitter that ice crusted lips and turned breath into knives. Farther west, the Pamir and Tian Shan mountains rose like stone walls, where snow-blinded eyes and avalanches crushed whole lines of men and beasts. In these passes, air thinned to a sharp edge, each gasp a struggle, each step a gamble against exhaustion. The barriers were not only of earth and weather. Politics built their own traps. Border checkpoints bristled with soldiers demanding tribute or bribes. Kingdoms rose and fell along the road, and a caravan welcome one year could find itself unwelcome the next. A merchant might survive the Taklamakan only to lose everything at the hands of an official eager to line his purse. Even alliances could be treacherous, for guides who knew the wells of the desert might abandon a caravan to rival raiders for the promise of silver. Disease also followed the path. Crowded into camps and caravanserais, men and animals shared more than goods. Fevers spread swiftly, and stomach sickness weakened entire groups in days. Some scholars later argued that even the great plagues of history rode on these same trails, hidden in fleas and rats that travelled unnoticed beside bolts of silk and bags of grain. And yet, the caravans kept moving. For every story of loss, there was another of survival, of merchants who braved the Taklamakan silence or crossed the frozen Pamirs to return home rich beyond measure. Danger was constant, but so was the hunger for fortune. On the Silk Road, death and wealth marched side by side, and every traveller knew that survival itself was the greatest treasure of all. The Silk Road did not exist apart from empires. It pulsed with their rise and faltered with their fall. From the moment Emperor Wu of the Han dynasty pushed westward in the 2nd century before the Common Era, the road became an extension of imperial ambition. Han armies fortified the Hexi corridor with garrisons and watchtowers, planting seeds of safety along routes that had once been the domain of raiders. For centuries, Chinese silk flowed outward under this protection, its shimmer carrying the prestige of the dynasty into lands that had never seen the Middle Kingdom. To the west, the Roman Empire became a ravenous customer. By the 1st century of the Common Era, senators and patricians draped themselves in silks that clung scandalously to their forms, sparking moral outrage even as merchants grew rich. Rome poured silver into the east in exchange for silk, glass, and spices. So much that some Roman writers lamented that the empire was bleeding its wealth into foreign hands. Yet the craving never stopped. For Romans, silk was not only luxury, it was empire made visible on the body. Between these two poles stood Persia, the Sasanian Empire rising in the 3rd century of the Common Era to dominate the central arteries of trade. Persian kings taxed caravans heavily, but they also maintained roads, guarded passes, and made their empire the indispensable bridge between East and West. Their cities glittered with wealth, skimmed from the flow of goods, and their influence was felt in every exchange. Then came the Mongols. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan and his successors carved a domain that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Danube. For a brief, extraordinary moment, nearly the entire Silk Road lay under one rule. The Pax Mongolica, as later historians called it, brought unprecedented security. Merchants travelled farther and faster, caravans moved under the watch of imperial messengers, and even Venetian traders like Marco Polo could cross Asia to the court of Kublai Khan. Under the Mongols, the Silk Road reached its greatest breadth, its arteries carrying not just silk and spices, but technologies like gunpowder and paper, ideas that would ignite revolutions in Europe. Yet empires are fragile. With their collapse came fractures. The Han fell, the Romans crumbled, the Sasanians fell to Arab conquest, and the Mongol Empire shattered into warring khanates. Each fall sent ripples through the Silk Road, tightening one link even as another loosened. The road survived, but always in the shadow of power. Its strength was never its own. It was a whisper, carried on the ambitions of emperors and the breath of armies. The Silk Road carried more than bolts of silk and jars of spice. It carried belief, knowledge, and imagination. Along its length, ideas moved as invisibly as wind, reshaping societies as profoundly as any caravan of treasure. Buddhism was among the earliest faiths to ride the road. From India, monks travelled north through the Kushan kingdom and into the deserts of Central Asia. Their scriptures rolled tight in leather cases, their chants echoing in caravanserais. They carved monasteries into cliffs, most famously at Dunhuang on the edge of the Taklamakan, where painted caves bloomed with images of bodhisattvas and celestial guardians. By the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, Buddhism had spread deep into China, shaping art, philosophy, and kingship. Islam followed centuries later, carried eastward by merchants and scholars after the Arab conquests of the 7th century. Mosques rose in Samarkand and Bukhara, their domes catching the sun in turquoise and gold. With faith came knowledge. Muslim astronomers mapped the heavens, mathematicians refined algebra, and physicians compiled texts that crossed into Europe, laying foundations for medieval science. In the bazaars of Central Asia, traders discussed prayer times alongside the prices of pepper and silk, weaving belief seamlessly into daily commerce. Christianity travelled as well. Nestorian missionaries moved eastward from Mesopotamia by the 6th century, establishing communities as far as China's Tang capital of Chang'an. Their crosses were often hidden, their churches modest, yet their presence testified to the road's reach. In some cities, Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Christian priests could be found within walking distance of one another, their debates sharp, their exchanges cautious, yet their coexistence undeniable. Ideas did not stop with religion. Music moved in fragments of melody, blending Persian lutes with Chinese zithers. Medicine travelled in recipes and remedies, from Indian herbs to Greek surgical techniques. Astrology drifted between cultures, carrying predictions written in stars and planets, reinterpreted anew in each land it touched. Even food bore the mark of exchange. Grapes, once foreign to China, were planted in imperial vineyards after envoys brought them east. The flow of faith and knowledge was rarely peaceful. At times, it brought tension, as rulers chose which religions to embrace and which to suppress. Yet the exchanges endured. A bolt of silk could be stolen, a caravan seized, but ideas once spoken could not be reclaimed. They travelled farther than any merchant, passed from ear to ear, from text to text, until they reshaped worlds. By the height of the medieval period, the Silk Road was no longer just a corridor of commerce. It was a highway of thought, carrying gods, sciences, and stories across continents, binding cultures not only through trade but through the unseen weight of belief. For all the wealth and wisdom it carried, the Silk Road also bore shadows. Alongside bolts of silk and jars of spice, it ferried sickness, silent and unseen, threading death across continents. The very arteries that connected empires became the veins through which plague moved. Caravans crowded with men, beasts, and goods created perfect conditions for disease. Fleas clung to furs, rats nested in sacks of grain, and fevers passed quickly in the close air of caravanserais. A cough in Kashgar could echo weeks later in Samarkand, and from there travel farther west, carried by hands that exchanged coins or by lips that shared bowls of water. For most of history, these outbreaks remained local tragedies. Yet in the 14th century, the most devastating plague in human memory rode the Silk Road outward. The Black Death began in the steppes of Central Asia, its origin still debated by scholars. Some point to rodent populations in the Tian Shan Mountains, others to trade hubs along the edge of the Taklamakan. Wherever it began, the pestilence followed the trails of commerce. Merchants carried it westward through caravan towns, then south along maritime routes. By the time it reached the ports of the Mediterranean, it had become an unstoppable tide. Europe remembered it as the bubonic plague, a sickness that blackened flesh and hollowed cities. In the space of a few years, it swept across the continent, killing tens of millions. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay fallow, bells tolled in empty streets where no one remained to answer them. In the Middle East, cities like Damascus and Cairo staggered under the same weight. From Italy to India, the same road that once carried silk and scripture now carried death. The irony was bitter. The Silk Road had been celebrated as a bridge between civilizations, a channel of prosperity and culture. Yet its strength, the ability to connect distant lands swiftly and efficiently, became its curse. No empire could seal its gates fast enough. No caravan could outrun what nestled unseen in their packs. And still, the road endured. Even after plague-scoured populations, caravans returned. The hunger for goods and knowledge proved stronger than fear. Trade resumed, though slower, as survivors learned to live with the spectre of disease. In this way, the Silk Road revealed its dual nature. It was never purely a path of wealth, nor purely a harbinger of ruin. It was both, carrying in equal measure the gifts and the griefs of human exchange. The Silk Road, once the world's most vital artery of exchange, did not vanish in a single moment. Its decline unfolded slowly, like a flame guttering against wind. By the late medieval centuries, the patterns of trade that had bound east and west for over a millennium began to fracture under pressures both natural and man-made. The Mongol Empire had briefly given the road unprecedented safety, but its collapse in the 14th century shattered that fragile unity. Warring Khanates turned stretches of the route into contested ground, and the old protections disappeared. Caravans now faced not only deserts and mountains but endless tolls, shifting alliances, and roads that changed hands as fast as news could travel. To many merchants, the risks outweighed the rewards. Meanwhile, new powers rose on the seas. In the 15th century, Portuguese sailors rounded Africa's Cape of Good Hope, charting routes that carried ships directly between Europe and Asia. Maritime trade was faster, cheaper, and less vulnerable to raids. Spices, once the jewels of caravan trade, now filled the holds of galleons. Silk itself began to travel by ship, bypassing the dust and danger of the overland road. The ocean became the new Silk Road, and the caravans dwindled. The rise of the Ottoman Empire also reshaped the balance. By the 15th and 16th centuries, its control over the eastern Mediterranean gave it dominance over land routes. Heavy taxes and restrictions pushed European merchants to look elsewhere, fueling the voyages of exploration that would redraw the world. The Silk Road was no longer the sole bridge between continents. It had competition it could not withstand. And yet, the road never entirely died. Markets in Samarkand and Kashgar still bustled with regional trade. Caravans continued to cross the Pamirs and deserts, though fewer in number and humbler in scale. What faded was not the road itself, but its centrality. The Silk Road, that had once dazzled Rome, fed Persia, and enriched China, became a shadow of its former glory, a path remembered more for its legend than its present. By the dawn of the modern era, the Silk Road was a memory, invoked in poetry and history as a symbol of human ambition and connection. Its decline did not erase its legacy. It had carried more than goods. It had carried cultures into collision, religions across continents, and knowledge into new ages. The road had bound the world before the world had ever known it could be bound. Step back from the dust of caravans and the shadows of bazaars. What remains of the Silk Road is not a single path traced across a map, but a memory of connection. For more than 1,000 years, its trails carried silk, spices, and glass, but also stories, gods, and ideas. It bound together empires that never met, and it carried the whispers of cultures into places that had never imagined one another. Its dangers were real. Sandstorms buried travelers. Raiders turned fortunes into corpses. Plague followed in silence, leaving entire cities hollowed out. Yet the road endured because the hunger for exchange was greater than fear. It revealed something enduring about human ambition, that no barrier, whether desert, mountain, or sea, could silence the urge to reach outward. Even in decline, the Silk Road never disappeared entirely. Its spirit lives on in the cities it once nourished, in the manuscripts translated across languages, in the foods and faiths that crossed continents. A bolt of silk that shimmered in a Roman villa, a Buddhist sutra carved into the caves of Don Huang, a recipe that blended spices from 3 different lands, all are fragments of the same long journey. The road is not gone. It is scattered across the world in echoes. Today, when historians speak of globalization, they are speaking of a dream first attempted by men and women who tied their fortunes to camels and wagons. The Silk Road was their internet, their lifeline, their promise that no civilization exists alone. To walk its length, even in memory, is to feel the truth it carried. The world has always been restless. It has always been reaching for itself,